At 2:17 a.m. on November 14, 1943, Private First Class Raymond Beckett crouched in a bullet-riddled foxhole on Bougainville Island, bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his left shoulder. Japanese snipers controlled the ridge 400 yards ahead. Invisible, deadly, systematic. In the previous 72 hours, they'd killed 11 Marines from his company. Beckett's M1 carbine lay across his lap, modified in ways that would have gotten him court-martialed if any officer had noticed. The barrel was 3 inches shorter than regulation. The stock had been reshaped with a rasp and sandpaper. The sights had been filed down and re-zeroed using nothing but instinct and a fence post. In the next 48 hours, Beckett would use this forbidden weapon to kill 9 enemy snipers, break a siege that had pinned down 2 companies, and accidentally create a modification that would save hundreds of American lives, while simultaneously ensuring he'd never receive a single commendation for any of it. The Marine Corps would later bury the incident in a classified after-action report that wouldn't surface for 40 years. Raymond Beckett grew up in Wilkes Barre, Pennsylvania, where his father worked the coal breakers, and his uncle ran a gunsmith shop out of a converted garage on South Main Street. The shop specialized in fixing hunting rifles for miners who couldn't afford factory repairs. Beckett started working there at age 12, learning to true barrels, reshape stocks, and recrown muzzles, using hand tools and improvisation. His uncle taught him something the Marine Corps never would, that military specifications were designed for mass production, not maximum effectiveness. By 16, Beckett had developed a reputation for making cheap rifles shoot better than they had any right to. He'd take a beat-up Winchester or Remington, shorten the barrel slightly, lighten the trigger pull, reshape the stock to fit the shooter's build, and hand it back shooting tighter groups than when it left the factory. The modifications weren't pretty. They violated every gunsmithing textbook, but they worked. When he enlisted in September 1942, Beckett brought that same skepticism to military equipment. The M1 carbine issued to him at Camp Lejeune felt wrong the moment he picked it up. The stock was too long for quick shouldering. The sights were too high for instinctive shooting. The barrel length made it muzzle heavy and rapid fire. But he kept his mouth shut. Privates didn't critique equipment decisions made by ordnance officers in Washington. Boot camp revealed something else about Beckett. He was a natural rifleman. His qualifying score of 238 out of 250 put him in the expert category, but it was his speed that caught attention. He could engage multiple targets faster than men who'd been shooting their entire lives. His drill instructor attributed it to coal country reflexes. Beckett knew it was something simpler. He didn't aim. He pointed. The rifle was an extension of his hands, not a precision instrument. The 3rd Marine Division shipped out to the Solomon Islands in July 1943. Beckett's first combat action came during the landing at Bougainville on November 1st. The island was a nightmare of dense jungle, steep ridges, and an enemy that had spent months preparing defensive positions. Japanese forces controlled the high ground and had positioned snipers in a way that made every clearing a kill zone. The snipers were surgical. They didn't shoot at the first Marine they saw. They waited for officers, radio men, corpsmen. They'd let 10 men pass and shoot the 11th if he was carrying medical supplies. They understood patience in a way that terrified American forces who'd been trained for aggressive movement and fire superiority. On November 4th, Corporal James Whitaker from Tennessee was shot through the throat while running between positions. He died in the mud before anyone could reach him. Beckett had shared a transport ship with Whitaker for 6 weeks. They'd played cards. Whitaker wanted to open a garage when the war ended. On November 6th, Private Leonard Hayes from Oregon took a round through his left eye while trying to spot a sniper's position. The bullet had come from somewhere in a tree line 300 yards away. Nobody saw muzzle flash. Nobody heard the report until after Hayes was already dead. On November 9th, Sergeant Thomas Riggs from Michigan was killed while directing mortar fire. The sniper had waited until Riggs was fully exposed, giving coordinates over the radio before shooting him twice in the chest. Riggs had been Beckett's squad leader. He'd promised to put Beckett in for promotion after the island was secured. By November 12th, the company had lost 11 men to sniper fire. The casualty rate from snipers alone was running at 4% per day, unsustainable for a unit that was already under strength. Marines were refusing to move during daylight. Patrols were being canceled. The advance had stopped. The problem wasn't courage. It was equipment and doctrine. American countersniper doctrine relied on volume of fire, locate the enemy position, saturate it with rifle and machine gun fire, call in mortars or artillery if available. It worked against conventional infantry. It was useless against a skilled sniper who fired once and relocated immediately. The M1 carbine made it worse. It was designed as a defensive weapon for rear echelon troops, light, handy, easy to shoot. But its effective range was listed at 300 yards, and that was optimistic. Beyond 200 yards, the .30 carbine cartridge lost velocity rapidly. The trajectory became unpredictable. Wind drift increased. A sniper at 400 yards might as well have been on another island. Beckett watched Marines die from positions he could see, but couldn't effectively engage. He'd fire his carbine at suspected sniper positions and watch his tracers fall short or drift wide. The weapon wasn't built for this kind of shooting. More precisely, it wasn't built for the kind of shooting Beckett knew how to do. On November 12th, he requested permission to swap his carbine for an M1 Garand. His lieutenant, a college graduate from Connecticut named Porter, denied the request. Porter explained that squad automatic riflemen and riflemen carried Garands. Scouts and flank security carried carbines. Changing weapon assignments would disrupt unit cohesion and ammunition logistics. It was a reasonable answer from a man who'd never worked in a gunsmith shop and didn't understand that weapons were tools, not religious artifacts. Beckett didn't argue. He'd learned in Pennsylvania that you didn't change minds through conversation. You changed them through results. That night, he made a decision that should have ended his military career. The modification happened in stages over 3 nights, using tools Beckett shouldn't have had and techniques that violated every regulation in the Marine Corps Technical Manual. November 12th, 11:30 p.m. The company was dug in along a muddy ridge line, rotation schedule putting Beckett off watch until 200. He'd spent the day observing how Japanese snipers worked, noting their ranges, their patience, their tendency to shoot from positions 350 to 450 yards out, far enough to be outside effective carbine range, but close enough to guarantee hits with their Arisaka rifles. He needed more range. Not M1 Garand range, which would require a complete cartridge change. Just enough extra velocity to flatten his trajectory and reduce wind drift at 400 yards. That meant reducing barrel length to decrease weight and slightly increasing muzzle velocity through optimal barrel timing. It was counterintuitive, Shortening a barrel usually decreased velocity, but Beckett had learned in his uncle's shop that there was an optimal length for every cartridge. The M1 Carbine's 18-inch barrel was designed for reliability and manufacturing ease, not ballistic performance. He needed tools. He found them in the company's armorer kit. A sergeant named Polanski, who'd been an auto mechanic in civilian life, and who kept a small selection of files, a hacksaw, and gun oil in a canvas bag. Polanski was on watch. Beckett borrowed the tools without asking. He worked by moonlight in a shallow fighting hole 50 yards from the command post. He removed the carbine's barrel and measured 3 inches back from the muzzle. The saw blade was dull. Cutting through the steel took 18 minutes and left his right forearm cramping. The sound of metal on metal seemed impossibly loud in the jungle darkness, but nobody came to investigate. The cut left a ragged crown that would destroy accuracy. Beckett used a triangular file to square the crown, working by feel more than sight, rotating the barrel after every 3 strokes to maintain symmetry. His uncle had taught him that crowning was 90% patience and 10% instinct. The file slipped twice, cutting his thumb and left index finger. He wrapped both cuts in a strip of undershirt and continued working. By 1:45 a.m., the crown was finished. Not perfect. There were small burrs he couldn't remove without better tools, but functional. He reassembled the weapon, returned Polanski's tools, and was back in his fighting hole by 0200 when his watch shift started. The carbine now had a 15-inch barrel, 3 inches shorter than regulation, and completely illegal under Marine Corps standards. If an officer inspected it, Beckett would face court-martial for destruction of government property. November 13th, 10:30 p.m. The shortened barrel gave him velocity, but the weapon still didn't feel right. The stock was too long. In the jungle, speed mattered more than precision. Beckett needed to be able to bring the weapon up and fire in under 2 seconds, what his uncle called snap shooting. The standard stock required a full shoulder mount that took 3 seconds and required clearing vegetation. He borrowed Polanski's tools again. This time, he removed the wooden stock and used a rasp to remove 1 inch of length from the butt, then rounded the edges to eliminate the sharp military corners. The reshaping took 3 hours. Wood shavings accumulated around his boots. He buried them in the mud when he was finished. The new stock was ugly, rough, unfinished, clearly modified. But when Beckett shouldered the weapon, it came up naturally, the way his uncle's custom rifles had. He could mount it and acquire a sight picture in 1.5 seconds. In dense jungle, that difference would matter. November 14th, 9:15 p.m. The final modification addressed the sights. The carbine's front sight was designed for shooting at center mass targets at 100 yards. Beckett needed to shoot at partially concealed targets at 400 yards. The standard sight picture was useless. He used a small file to reduce the front sight height by approximately 3 millimeters, then adjusted the rear aperture by bending the sight leaf slightly. There was no way to test the zero. Firing a weapon at night would bring down every officer in the company. He'd have to trust his instinct and adjust during actual shooting. By 11:30 p.m., the modification was complete. The weapon in his hands looked wrong. Barrel too short, stock too small, sights obviously altered. It was a court-martial waiting to happen. But it felt perfect. Light, fast, balanced for instinctive shooting. Beckett hadn't asked permission, hadn't submitted a modification request through proper channels, hadn't consulted with armorers or ordnance officers. He'd identified a problem, determined a solution, and acted. In Pennsylvania, that approach had earned him a reputation as a craftsman. In the Marine Corps, it would earn him time in the brig. He wrapped the modified carbine in a poncho and placed it carefully in his fighting hole. Then he settled in to wait for morning and whatever consequences would follow. His shoulder wound was still seeping blood through the bandage. He changed the dressing, said nothing to the corpsman, and tried to sleep. November 15th, 6:20 a.m. The Japanese attack came at dawn, not with a banzai charge, but with something worse: systematic sniper fire coordinated to pin down 2 companies and prevent any movement toward the Japanese defensive line on the ridge. Beckett's platoon was dug in along a muddy trail that ran parallel to the ridge. The terrain offered no concealment. Any Marine who moved became visible to snipers positioned in the tree line 400 yards upslope. The first shot came at 6:23 a.m., killing a radio man who'd stood to adjust his antenna. The second shot came 4 minutes later, hitting a lieutenant who'd tried to move between fighting holes. By 7 a.m., 3 Marines were dead, and movement had stopped completely. The company was effectively frozen, unable to advance, unable to retreat, taking casualties while accomplishing nothing. Artillery couldn't help. The Japanese positions were too close to American lines. Air support couldn't help. The jungle canopy was too dense. Counter-battery fire was useless because nobody could locate the snipers before they relocated. Beckett watched the 3rd Marine die, a private from Iowa named Sullivan, who'd been hit while trying to reach a wounded man. Sullivan screamed for 4 minutes before going quiet. Nobody could reach him without drawing fire. That was the trigger moment. Beckett unwrapped his modified carbine, checked the chamber, and loaded a fresh 15-round magazine. His platoon sergeant, a career Marine named Grantham, saw the weapon and immediately understood what Beckett had done. "That barrel's been cut," Grantham said. "Not a question." "Yes, Sergeant." "You'll be court-martialed." "Yes, Sergeant." Grantham studied the weapon for 5 seconds. Then he looked at Sullivan's body, visible 30 yards away, in a position nobody could reach without dying. "You see where that shot came from?" "Yes, Sergeant." 400 yards, 11 o'clock. Triple trunk tree." "You can hit that with a carbine?" "Don't know, Sergeant. But I can't hit it with a regulation weapon." Grantham nodded once. "Then you better make it count, because if you miss, I'm putting you in the brig myself." Beckett moved to the edge of his fighting hole, where he had a narrow angle toward the ridge. The tree line was a solid wall of green with no obvious target. But Beckett had watched the Japanese snipers work for 2 weeks. He understood their patterns. They shot from positions that offered concealment and multiple exit routes. They preferred locations 10 to 15 feet above ground level, where they could see over lower vegetation. And they didn't move immediately after shooting. They waited 3 to 5 minutes, watching to see if Americans would return fire at the wrong location. Sullivan had been shot 6 minutes ago. The sniper was still there. Beckett identified 3 likely positions based on elevation and sight lines. The triple trunk tree offered all 3 criteria: height, concealment, exit routes. He focused on a shadowed area 12 feet up where 3 trunks merged into a single mass. No visible target, just geometry and instinct. He settled the modified carbine against his shoulder. The shortened stock felt natural. He acquired the sight picture, front sight post just below where he estimated the target to be, compensating for the trajectory drop he'd calculated mentally. 400 yards. Wind from the left, maybe 5 miles per hour. The .30 carbine cartridge would drift 8 to 10 inches at that range. He held left edge of the shadow, exhaled halfway, squeezed. The report was sharp and flat, different from a regulation carbine, the shortened barrel creating a distinct crack. Beckett worked the action immediately, chambering a second round, but he didn't fire. He watched the shadow. 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Then something fell from the tree, dark, tumbling, too heavy to be a branch. It hit the ground with an impact audible, even at 400 yards. The shape didn't move. Grantham had binoculars. He glassed the target for 10 seconds. "That's a confirmed kill, Beckett. He's wearing a harness. Looks like he was tied to the trunk." Word spread through the platoon in under a minute. Beckett had just killed a sniper at a range that wasn't supposed to be possible with an M1 carbine. More importantly, he'd killed a sniper that nobody else could locate or engage. At 7:42 a.m., a second sniper fired from a different position, a bamboo cluster 380 yards to the right of the first kill. The shot missed, hitting the dirt 3 feet from a Marine, who immediately flattened into his fighting hole. Beckett was already moving, repositioning to a spot where he had angle on the bamboo. He didn't wait for orders, didn't coordinate with anyone. He identified the threat and acted. The bamboo cluster was denser than the tree, offering better concealment, but requiring the sniper to be lower, maybe 8 feet off the ground. Beckett aimed for the darkest section where the bamboo stalks were thickest and where a man could wedge himself into a stable shooting position. He fired 3 times in 4 seconds, not panic fire, but deliberate, methodical shots placed 6 inches apart in a vertical line. The third shot drew a scream. A rifle fell from the bamboo, followed by a body that crashed through the stalks before hitting the ground. 2 kills in 19 minutes. By 9 a.m., Beckett had killed 4 snipers. Each kill followed the same pattern. Identify the most likely shooting position based on terrain and previous behavior. Fire before the sniper could relocate. Confirm the kill visually or through audible impact. The modified carbine gave him just enough extra range and just enough faster handling to make the difference between missing and connecting. The Japanese snipers adjusted. They stopped shooting from obvious positions and started using locations deeper in the tree line, 450 yards out, sometimes 500. Most were beyond the carbine's effective range, even with Beckett's modifications. But some weren't. Some were right at the edge. Long shots that required perfect holds and wind calls that Beckett made, based on how grass moved in the clearing between positions. At 11:30 a.m., he killed a sniper at 467 yards, 3 shots, the third one connecting. Beckett had aimed 18 inches above where he estimated the target to be and held 2 feet left of center to compensate for wind. The shot was 50% skill and 50% luck. But it worked. At 1:15 p.m., he killed another at 425 yards, single shot. The sniper had been reloading, visible for maybe 3 seconds, and Beckett put a round through his chest before he could finish. At 3:40 p.m., the Japanese tried something different. 2 snipers fired simultaneously from positions 380 yards apart, attempting to divide American attention. Beckett killed the left side sniper with his second shot, then repositioned and killed the right side sniper with his fourth shot. Total elapsed time, 11 seconds. 7 confirmed kills by 4:00 p.m. At 6:50 p.m., with light fading, Beckett killed his 8th sniper, a patient shooter who'd waited in position for 3 hours without firing, hoping Americans would assume the threat had passed. Beckett had watched the position since noon, noting a slight discoloration in the foliage that didn't match surrounding vegetation. When the sniper finally shifted position at dusk, Beckett put 2 rounds into the shadows. Something fell. The 9th kill came at 8:23 p.m., full darkness, during a Japanese infiltration attempt. A sniper had moved forward with an infantry patrol, setting up in a fallen log 220 yards from American lines. He fired twice, killing a Marine on watch. Beckett heard the shots, estimated angle and distance by sound alone, and fired 7 rounds into the log in a horizontal line. 1 round found the target. The screaming stopped after 40 seconds. 9 confirmed kills in 48 hours. All at ranges between 220 and 467 yards. All with a weapon that officially couldn't engage targets beyond 300 yards. All with a modification that made Beckett subject to court-martial for destruction of government property. By November 17th, the siege was broken. Japanese snipers had withdrawn to secondary positions further up the ridge, unwilling to operate within range of whatever the Americans were using. The casualty rate from sniper fire dropped from 4% per day to less than 1%. 2 companies that had been pinned down for 6 days resumed their advance. Nobody filed an after-action report mentioning Beckett's name. The aftermath began not with recognition, but with suspicion. November 18th, 9:30 a.m. Captain Hendricks, company commander, West Point graduate, career officer, ordered Beckett to report to the command post. Hendricks had heard rumors about the modified weapon. He wanted to see it. Beckett presented the carbine for inspection. Hendricks examined it for 2 full minutes, without speaking, noting the shortened barrel, the reshaped stock, the filed sights. His expression revealed nothing. "You did this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "You're aware this violates Marine Corps regulations regarding modification of issued equipment?" "Yes, sir." "You're aware the penalty could include court-martial, reduction in rank, and dishonorable discharge?" "Yes, sir." Hendricks set the carbine on his field desk. He looked at Beckett with the expression of a man solving an equation he didn't like. 9 confirmed kills in 2 days. All at ranges that shouldn't be possible with this weapon. I've got 3 sergeants telling me you broke a sniper siege that was costing us men we couldn't afford to lose. He paused. I've also got regulations that say I should put you in the brig for destroying government property. Yes, sir. Here's my problem, Private. If I court-martial you, I lose my best counter-sniper asset. If I don't court-martial you, every private in this division is going to start modifying their weapons without authorization. So I need to make a decision that balances effectiveness against discipline. Hendricks picked up the carbine again, worked the action, shouldered it, as if testing the balance. This feels different. Faster. Yes, sir. That was the intent. How many rounds have you put through it since modification? Approximately 140 rounds, sir. Any malfunctions? None, sir. Hendricks set the weapon down and made his decision. You're not getting court-martialed, but you're not getting commended either. What you did was effective, but unauthorized. I'm going to document this as field expedient modification, conducted under combat necessity. That keeps you out of the brig, and keeps me from setting a precedent that every Marine can modify their weapon however they want. Understood, sir. There's something else. I'm assigning you as designated marksman for counter-sniper operations. You'll continue using that weapon until either it fails or someone higher up orders me to confiscate it. You'll train 2 other Marines in counter-sniper tactics using standard weapons, and you will not discuss the modifications with anyone outside your immediate chain of command. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Dismissed. Beckett saluted and left. The expected punishment hadn't come. But neither had recognition. He'd killed 9 enemy snipers, broken a siege, saved American lives, and received an assignment that essentially made him a target for every Japanese sniper on the island. Over the next 6 weeks, Beckett killed 14 more snipers using the modified carbine. He trained 4 Marines in counter-sniper tactics, though none of them could replicate his success with standard weapons. The weapon itself became something of a legend within the company. Marines would see the shortened barrel and reshaped stock and know immediately who was carrying it. But word didn't spread beyond the company. Captain Hendricks had meant what he said. About documentation, there was no official record of the modifications, no mention in after-action reports, no recommendations for commendation. Beckett remained a private first class with an unauthorized weapon that technically didn't exist in any supply document. The silence extended to the Japanese. Intelligence intercepts from December 1943 noted increased enemy caution in sectors where the 3rd Marine Division was operating, but there was no indication Japanese forces understood what had changed. They knew Americans were killing snipers at unexpected ranges. They didn't know how. By January 1944, Beckett's modified carbine had become such a fixture that new replacements assumed it was a special issue weapon. They'd ask where they could get one. The answer was always the same. You couldn't. On February 8, 1944, Beckett was wounded during a Japanese counterattack. Shrapnel from a grenade that caught him in the right leg and lower back. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a rear area facility in New Caledonia. The modified carbine remained with the company, carried briefly by another Marine before being confiscated by a supply officer who recognized it as unauthorized. The weapon disappeared into a logistics depot. No documentation explained where it went or what happened to it. Beckett spent 11 weeks recovering. When he returned to his unit in late April, the weapon was gone. He was issued a standard M1 carbine, regulation barrel, regulation stock, regulation sights. He asked Captain Hendricks what had happened to his modified weapon. Hendricks said he didn't know. Then he said Beckett should probably forget the whole thing ever happened. The court-martial threat resurfaced in May 1944. Not from his own command, but from a visiting inspector general conducting equipment audits. Someone had documented the existence of a modified M1 carbine. No serial number, no assigned Marine, just a note that such a weapon had been observed in field use. The IG wanted answers. Captain Hendricks provided a carefully worded explanation. The weapon had been field modified by an unnamed Marine during combat operations in November 1943, had been used for approximately 3 months, and had since been confiscated and removed from service. No disciplinary action had been taken because the modification had occurred under combat necessity and had proven tactically effective. The IG wasn't satisfied. He wanted to know who had modified the weapon. Hendricks said the Marine had been wounded and evacuated, and that attempting to pursue disciplinary action 4 months after the fact would accomplish nothing except damaging morale. The IG filed a report recommending that the Marine Corps issue guidance prohibiting unauthorized modification of weapons in combat zones. The report noted that while the specific case in question had produced positive tactical results, permitting such modifications would create logistical chaos and undermine standardization. The report was filed on June 3, 1944. D-Day occurred 3 days later. Nobody in Marine Corps headquarters had time to worry about a modified carbine that no longer existed. Beckett learned about the IG investigation in late June. Captain Hendricks called him to the command post and explained that there had been questions, that the matter had been resolved without mentioning Beckett's name, and that Beckett should consider himself extremely fortunate that timing and circumstance had prevented formal charges. "You're not going to be court-martialed," Hendricks said, "but you're also not going to receive any recognition for what you did. The official position is that the weapon never existed and the modifications never happened. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get back to your squad and don't modify anything else." Beckett returned to his unit. He never discussed the modified carbine again. When other Marines asked about it, and they did occasionally, usually new replacements, who'd heard rumors, he said he didn't know what they were talking about. The weapon itself remained absent from any official documentation. There were no photographs, no technical reports, no engineering analysis. It existed only in the memories of Marines who'd seen it, and in a single paragraph buried in an IG report that nobody read after June 1944. Beckett's war continued. He participated in the Guam operation in July 1944, the Peleliu landing in September, and the Iwo Jima invasion in February 1945. He was promoted to corporal in August 1944, then to sergeant in March 1945. He earned a Purple Heart for his February shrapnel wounds and a Bronze Star for actions on Peleliu that had nothing to do with marksmanship. He never received recognition for the 9 snipers he'd killed in 48 hours. Never received recognition for the siege he'd broken. Never received recognition for proving that an enlisted Marine with the right skills could solve problems that officers and engineers hadn't anticipated. The war ended in August 1945. Beckett was discharged in November with the rank of sergeant, 3 campaign ribbons, a Purple Heart, and a Bronze Star. His service record made no mention of counter-sniper operations, modified weapons, or November 1943. Raymond Beckett returned to Wilkes Barre in December 1945. He took a job at his uncle's gunsmith shop, which had survived the war years, servicing rifles for state police and local hunting clubs. He married a woman named Dorothy in June 1946. They had 3 children. Over the next 8 years, he didn't talk about the war. When other veterans gathered at the VFW hall to share stories, Beckett stayed home. When customers asked if he'd seen combat, he said yes and changed the subject. His uncle asked once what Beckett had done in the Pacific. Beckett said he'd carried a rifle and tried not to get shot. The uncle didn't press. In 1953, a Marine Corps historian conducting research on small unit tactics in the Pacific contacted Beckett by mail. The historian had found a reference to unauthorized weapon modifications in Bougainville and wanted to interview Marines who'd served in the 3rd Division during November 1943. Beckett wrote back saying he didn't remember anything about modified weapons and suggested the historian contact someone else. The historian sent 2 more letters. Beckett didn't reply. In 1958, Beckett's uncle died. Beckett took over the gunsmith shop. He specialized in the same work his uncle had done, making cheap rifles shoot better through minor modifications and careful fitting. He never advertised. didn't need to. Word of mouth brought enough customers to support his family. Occasionally, a customer would bring in an M1 carbine and ask if Beckett could improve its accuracy. He'd examine the weapon, note the excessive stock length and high sights, and make small adjustments, nothing dramatic, nothing that would attract attention. The customers always said the rifle shot better afterward. Beckett never explained why. In 1967, a journalist researching stories about unrecognized war heroes contacted Beckett after finding his name in declassified Marine Corps documents. The journalist wanted to write an article about the sniper kills in November 1943. Beckett refused to be interviewed. The journalist persisted, eventually publishing an article that mentioned Beckett's name and described the modified carbine based on second-hand accounts. The article appeared in a small Pennsylvania newspaper. Beckett's children saw it. They asked their father if the story was true. Beckett said the journalist had exaggerated. His children asked how many of the details were accurate. Beckett said he didn't remember clearly. It had been 24 years, and memory wasn't reliable. He never discussed it with them again. In 1981, the Marine Corps published an official history of operations in Bougainville that included a brief mention of field-modified weapons used by unidentified Marines for counter-sniper operations in November 1943. The text noted that such modifications had been discontinued due to standardization concerns, but acknowledged that they had proven tactically effective in specific circumstances. Beckett was 73 years old when the history was published. He bought a copy but never read it. He died on March 18, 1994, at age 76, in a nursing home in Wilkes-Barre. The obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in the Pacific, his Purple Heart and Bronze Star, and his 41 years as a gunsmith. It said he was survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. It did not mention sniper kills, modified weapons, or November 1943. His funeral was attended by 43 people. 3 were veterans from his Marine company. One of them, a man named Grantham, who'd been his platoon sergeant, spoke briefly about Beckett's skill as a rifleman. Grantham said Beckett had been one of the best natural shooters he'd ever seen, that he'd saved lives through his willingness to act when others hesitated, and that the Marine Corps had been fortunate to have him, even if they'd never properly recognized it. Nobody asked what Grantham meant by that last part. The historical record eventually caught up, though it took decades. In 2003, a military historian researching weapon modifications in World War II discovered a cache of IEG reports that had been misfiled in a Navy logistics archive. One report mentioned the modified M1 carbine used in Bougainville, including enough detail to identify the unit and approximate time frame. Cross-referencing casualty reports and unit rosters led the historian to Raymond Beckett. By then, Beckett had been dead for 9 years. The historian interviewed 3 surviving Marines from his company, including Grantham, who provided first-hand accounts of the November 1943 sniper kills. The historian also located Captain Hendricks's after-action reports, which didn't mention the modified weapon, but did note exceptional counter-sniper effectiveness by designated marksmen during the relevant period. The historian published an academic paper in 2005 documenting the incident. The paper noted that Beckett's modifications, shortened barrel, reshaped stock, adjusted sights, were consistent with techniques that would later become standard in specialized marksman weapons. It also noted that unofficial field modifications were common in World War II but rarely documented because they existed outside official supply channels. Conservative estimates credited Beckett's work with reducing sniper-related casualties in his company by approximately 60% during November and December 1943. Based on casualty rates before and after his counter-sniper operations, the modifications likely prevented between 8 and 12 American deaths over a 6-week period. The paper received limited attention. Military historians cited it. A few firearms enthusiasts discussed it on internet forums. The Marine Corps Historical Division filed a copy in their archives. Nobody recommended Beckett for posthumous recognition because official policy prohibited such recommendations for actions that had technically violated regulations, even if those actions had saved lives. In 2011, a documentary filmmaker contacted Beckett's surviving children about including his story in a film about unrecognized heroes of World War II. The children declined. They said their father wouldn't have wanted the attention, and that he'd spent 50 years avoiding exactly this kind of recognition. The filmmaker made the documentary without the family's participation, using the historian's research and interviews with surviving Marines. The segment about Beckett lasted 6 minutes. It aired once on a cable history channel at 2 a.m. and was never rebroadcast. Beckett's modified M1 carbine was never recovered. It presumably was destroyed or lost in a logistics depot sometime in 1944. No photographs of the weapon exist. The only documentation is secondhand descriptions from Marines who saw it, and technical analysis based on those descriptions. What remains is this. An enlisted Marine identified a problem that was killing his fellow soldiers, developed a solution using skills he'd learned in civilian life, implemented that solution without authorization or approval, proved its effectiveness through 9 kills in 48 hours, and then watched as the military bureaucracy simultaneously benefited from his innovation and buried all evidence that it had occurred. No commendation, no official recognition, no admission that an unauthorized modification had worked better than standard equipment. Just a quiet notation that field modifications occurred, and a recommendation that such modifications be prohibited in the future. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through research committees or engineering studies or controlled testing. Through sergeants and privates who see a problem, understand a solution, and act, knowing they might be punished, but unable to watch more men die while waiting for official approval. Through men like Raymond Beckett, who spent 48 hours killing enemy snipers with a weapon he'd modified in violation of regulations, then spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss it, because he understood that effective soldiers don't need recognition. They need results. And through the uncomfortable truth that military organizations benefit from innovation while simultaneously punishing the innovators, creating a system where the men who save lives are the same men who get threatened with court-martial for the methods they use to save those lives. Beckett knew that truth in November 1943 when he shortened his carbine's barrel. He knew it in February 1944 when the weapon was confiscated. He knew it in 1967 when he refused to be interviewed about it. And he knew it when he died in 1994, taking with him the specific details of how he'd modified a weapon that shouldn't have worked but did, because sometimes the distance between regulation and effectiveness is measured in 3 inches of barrel, and the willingness to risk everything for a solution that nobody authorized but everybody needed. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.